Firstly, I would like to thank the zetkin.forum and the organizers of this session for inviting me to talk to all of you on a very important subject. I have titled my talk, Neoliberalism Lays the Groundwork for the Rise of Neo-fascism. Now, I don't really need to explain what neoliberalism that we have been experiencing for the last 40 years is all about. You're all familiar with it. Uh, it involves income deflation through fiscal and monetary contraction, rise in unemployment, periodic bubbles which burst, creating asset deflation. And of course, we have also seen a tremendous rise in income inequality. There's also been a rise in poverty, which I will talk about towards the end, which is not generally recognized. Now, all this has been basically the result of the dominance of finance over industry. Now, finance capital has always shown a kind of obsession with controlling inflation, with no attention at all to the human costs involved. Now, theoretically, there are two ways in which inflation can be controlled in an economy. Namely, for a given level of aggregate demand, if output rises, then inflation will fall if there is inflation already. Or the second way is that for a given level of output, aggregate demand itself is contracted. Now, for some reason, finance capital has always chosen the second path, the inhumane path of contraction of aggregate demand for a given level of output. And the policies that have been followed under the general rubric of neoliberalism over the last 30 to 40 years and followed globally, as you know, bear an uncanny resemblance to the, in brackets, sound finance policies which were followed a century ago and which had led the entire capitalist world into depression. So I think it would be useful to go back in history for a short while and then return to present developments. Now, the dominance of finance over industry becomes very clear, particularly from the last quarter of the 19th century. And even though it is not recognized in the literature, I would argue that this is primarily because of the enormous liquidity which was released into the capitalist system by colonial exploitation. Metropolitan countries, particularly the world capitalist leader at that time, Britain, acquired complete control over the vast gold and foreign exchange earnings of their colonies of conquest, and therefore became, uh, more or less awash with liquidity. Rates of interest for financiers and capitalists in the metropolitan countries reached an all-time low. The analysis of finance capital is closely tied up with the rise of monopoly. And as we know, Rudolf Hilferding's pioneering work, Finance Capital, uh, specifically stresses the rise of monopoly and its connection with the dominance of finance over industry. This analysis has played a very important role in Marxist theory, and it also informed Lenin's analysis of imperialism, particularly in his book on imperialism. Now, this obsession of finance with controlling inflation and controlling inflation through mass income deflation, what explains it? Why does finance behave in this particular way? Nobody has found a very convincing answer yet, to my mind. Certainly, the economists have not. But perhaps going back to Marx's own circuits of capital in volume 1 of Capital might help us to reach an answer, where Marx distinguishes between two very different types of circuits of capital. One is the circuit of productive capital, which involves capitalists who actually use money in order to produce commodities for sale on the market. And this circuit of capital, as you know, is briefly summarized as capital M hyphen capital C hyphen capital C prime hyphen capital M prime. That is, the capitalist starts with a certain sum of money capital, then purchases raw materials, the means for producing, purchases labor power with that. And remember that wages are always part of capital within a capitalist system that the capitalist advances. So M is converted into C. Now, in the labor process, in the process of production, that generates surplus value, and the commodities which are then sold are, after the production process is over, is denoted as C prime, and they sell for a sum of money, M prime, which is greater than the M with which the whole process started, and the difference between M prime and M is the capitalist profit. Now, clearly, in this kind of a circuit of capital, the capitalist producer wants to sell his commodities. So he has an interest in expanding the market for commodities. He has an interest in seeing that the mass market for the commodities in which he is dealing actually grow. But this is very different in the case of the other circuit of capital that Marx discusses, which is when which is finance capital. The capitalist is a financier. And unlike a capitalist who makes his profit from actually engaging and organizing production, the financier engages in no production at all. That is the financier pure and simple. So this circuit of capital, the financier starts with sum of money, M, and ends up with a sum of money, M prime, which is greater than M, and there is no intermediation by way of production at all. So in the first case, money is used for producing commodities for sale and for appropriating profit. In the second case, money is used for making more money. And the two circuits of capital are completely different. And this, I think, might give us a clue as to why finance capitalists are not bothered about what is happening to production at all. And we in developing countries are very familiar with this, with the operation of our indigenous moneylenders, that we call sahukars, who traditionally have not shown any interest in production or improving the condition of producers, but who are simply interested in getting the maximum money out of producers, even at the cost of deteriorating their conditions of life, their conditions of production, even at the cost of completely pauperizing them. Now, I think capital, money capital, finance capital on a global scale operates in much the same manner. There is not much difference, except that we are here talking about trillions of dollars or trillions of Deutschmarks as opposed to mere, rupees to hundreds of rupees, as in the case of a developing country. Now, this dominance of finance over industry has meant that financiers who lend money to others and they make their money simply as a return on capital have an obsessive fear of inflation, because inflation would erode the real value of their income, and their income is interest. It is not profit, but really interest on the money they lend, and inflation also would erode the real value of their assets. So they are completely focused on what nowadays is called inflation targeting. And they insist, their obsessive fear is so great that whenever international financiers lend to governments, they insist on governments following austerity. They insist on governments deflating mass incomes through wages and incomes policies, through contractionary fiscal and monetary policies. Now, if we take two historical examples, that is uh, Germany, which you're all familiar with in the interwar period, and Japan, also in the interwar period. Now, in the case of Germany, as we all know, after defeat in the First World War, Germany was forced to pay reparations to the victors and thereby became very heavily indebted. The Weimar Republic was always quite fragile, and even though the unemployed were numerous, the rate of unemployment in the 1920s in Germany was already quite high. Germany's international creditors insisted on contracting
Utsa? Utsa, kannst du mich hören? Can you hear me? You're frozen at the moment. Of course, the moment you speak about Germany is when German internet
who,
gives out.
from 1931 onwards, imposed as many as 5 rounds of wage cuts and public expenditure cuts in order to satisfy international creditors that Germany remained creditworthy. Now, this, of course, led to a phenomenal increase in distress within the population of Germany, particularly the working population. Unemployment, according to some recent estimates carried out in 2022 and 2024, unemployment doubled. That is, the numbers unemployed doubled to about 6 million by the end of 1932. And the GDP of Germany fell in a single year by almost 5%, that is in 1932. Now, this kind of pervasive distress of the working classes and of the masses naturally arouses enormous anger, and this is what provides a fertile ground for the right of far for the rise of far right political parties. There is actually a polarization in society. On the one hand, you have an increasing, as it were, hold of the left parties. On the other hand, the rise of the fascist movements, or what later came to be known as fascist movements, which in the case of Germany, of course, meant that there was a meteoric rise of Hitler to power, from being really a very small party to being an extremely important one, just in the course of about 18 months or so. Now, similarly, in Japan, and of course, I mean, you know much more about Germany than I do, so I don't want to go into the contentious problems of uh, to what extent Hitler's rise was preventable, to what extent it was really the result of failure of the Social Democrats and the Communists to come together. After all, Germany had the strongest and most powerful communist movement in the whole of the capitalist world. And if they had come together to recognize the danger of fascism, and if they had actually opposed the rise of Hitler, the history of the world, of Europe, would certainly have been very different. But actually, what the fascist parties do, and typically this is the way they rise to power, is to turn the anger of the people in the wrong direction, as we know, instead of identifying the cause of their distress, which is the insistence of finance capital on deflating mass incomes. They instead point to minorities within society and say that these are the people who are taking away your jobs, they are the villains, they are responsible. In the case of Germany, as we know, it was the Jews, it was the gypsies, And later on, when the Fascist Party comes to power, it tries to overcome the economic crisis through violent external expansionism at the expense of the sovereignty of other countries, at the expense of crushing the labor movement in neighboring countries as well. Now, you have a very similar picture unfolding in Japan, where uh, Finance Minister Inoue, in order to show that the Japanese economy was sound and creditworthy, imposed deflationary policies on the very eve of the 1929 Great Crash, which presaged the industrial depression. Of course, the agricultural depression had started even earlier. So when he imposed deflation, this led to rise in unemployment and enormous distress within the Japanese working classes. And of course, this again provided a fertile ground for a transition from, in any case, Japanese democracy was very shaky, as was German, but it provided a very fertile ground for a transition to Japanese militarism. So, from the beginning, Japanese fascism took the form of militarism and expansionism against neighboring countries. When Finance Minister Takahashi came in 1931, he started reflationary policies. Some of these reflationary policies have been hailed by Ben Bernanke as, presaging Keynes, of representing Keynesianism before Keynes. And it is true that Takahashi did undertake public expenditure expansion from 1931 onwards. There was quite a lot of money allocated to things like irrigation and public works and so on for generating employment within Japan. But simultaneously, the Japanese economy also launched on very aggressive expansionism vis-a-vis Manchuria, northern China. In 1931, uh, Manchuria was occupied, and between 1931 and 1937, it was turned into a puppet state, the state of Manchukuo, which provided the base for Japan's subsequent aggression against China in 1937. For in East Asia, the war started not in 1939, but in 1937. So you have a very similar denouement when Takahashi in 1936 wanted to call a halt to further militarization, because by then the depression had been overcome, and it had been overcome in Japan by these means. In fact, several years before it was overcome in Britain or in the United States. But the military elements in Japan, the military forces in Japan, by then had tasted power to such an extent that they were not to be stopped, and they got Takahashi assassinated, as we know. The year after Takahashi's last budget, the new budget allocated almost 90% of Japanese revenues to further expansion of the Japanese military. So, the point is that history gives us ample warning of what happens when governments follow income deflating policies which reduce mass purchasing power and which raise unemployment. Now, as we all know, after the war, there was a Keynesian interregnum when countries were recovering from the destruction of the war, and on the whole, expansionary public policies were followed, but it didn't last very long. From 1945 to the very early 1970s, until the oil shock, to be more precise. From the oil shock, and I won't go into the interregnum period very much, you are all familiar with it, but proceed immediately to the question of the oil shocks, to the modern period of the dominance of finance capital, which starts from the early 1970s, when all previous Keynesian reflationary policies were completely reversed, And you had a new feature, the international financial institutions, particularly the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which together are referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions, started instituting deflationary economic policies. And by the end of the 1980s, from the International Monetary Fund reports itself, we see that over 90 countries worldwide had to follow austerity programs. And many of them, particularly in Africa, had to follow austerity programs several times, not once, not the first austerity program was followed by one of moderate, another austerity program, and then you had intensive austerity program where there was a third austerity program in the same country. Such a centralized uh, institutional intervention by international financial institutions was completely unique in the modern world. It had never been seen before. And it was, of course, highly successful from the point of view of finance capital. We have seen the untrammeled sway, the hubris of global finance capital now for the last at least 45, almost 50 years. And it has had the predictable consequences. And I may say here that in the beginning, this was not called so much as neoliberal deflationism as globalization. Now, globalization sounded very good, and I think to some extent, uh, the left parties and left movements were taken in by the whole rhetoric of globalization. Um, I think that they failed to see that neoliberalism was nothing but an expression of the renewed domination of finance capital, the renewed domination of uh, the, the renewed recreation within the advanced capitalist world itself of the same kind of conditions which had given rise to fascism a century earlier. It was a renewal of neo imperialism as well. Now, neoliberalism caused enormous distress to the working class in the advanced capitalist countries. And this is something I think that the left movement did not recognize sufficiently. Uh, I think many people were taken in. They fail to see, in my view, that finance led globalization is a very different thing from people led globalization. They thought globalization per se was a good thing. I know very many far left friends of mine were very positive about globalization. They fail to see its negative aspects completely. And of course, the impact on the global south of neoliberal policies, which involved this kind of fiscal and monetary austerity, which involved uh, control over mass purchasing power expanding too fast, which involved, in their case, devaluation of their currency. All this led to an enormous rise in mass distress and loss of mass purchasing power, which is actually not recognized in the literature at all. The World Bank, every single government in the world, whether advanced country or developing country, has been putting forward false estimates of poverty decline. They have been claiming that the period of neoliberalism has been one in which millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. This is not true at all. In fact, it is a complete falsehood. These calculations of poverty decline by the World Bank and by individual country governments, including by our government in India and by the government in China, are based on a simple logical mistake. They involve a wrong statistical procedure in which the quantities and uh, and items of consumption goods that people consumed 50 years ago
Utsa? Utsa, kannst du mich hören? Can you hear me, Utsa? Your image is frozen. I don't know if it's the internet here or the internet there. Well, I think we will just have to be patient, as I asked you in the beginning. Okay, we lost Utsa complete. Wir haben Utsa ganz, sie ist raus. Utsa, kannst du mich noch, can you hear me still? Oh. She's back, you're back, that's wonderful. Please repeat your last sentence if you can. Thank you, and sorry for the difficulties with the technology.
Yes. I was saying that the actual poverty levels in every country in the global south is extremely high if we actually apply the original definition of the poverty line. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Excellent. It
Can
works
you
very
hear
well.
me?
Yes, we can hear
Oh,
you.
good. Good, good. All right. So, in fact, it has led to enormous rise in poverty, not just in a rise in inequality, but also absolute immiserization of the mass of the people. Now, as a consequence, we see exactly the same result unfolding here in country after country. Uh, the anger of the people has been turned in the wrong direction, whether it is in Europe and the global north, or it is in the global countries of the global south, we see the rise in country after country of the forces of fascism, which of course we call neo-fascism, because it is not does not take exactly the same form as it did a century ago, uh, but naturally is affected by the concrete circumstances of every country that we are talking about. But whether it is a Milei in Argentina, an Orban in Hungary, an Erdogan in Turkey, a Meloni in Italy, a Modi in India, or above all, a Trump in
What did you want to say? Oh, in the USA. Okay. So we should finish the sentences now. Utsa, we lost you again. I don't know if you can hear me even. This is very tricky. I'm not sure how to proceed on this one. Okay. I should not. So I think if we can hear you, maybe we can finish the intervention without picture. Is that helpful? I guess we're still trying.
hello.
Hello, Utsa. I'm so sorry about this. I guess we will
Yes.
just try one more
Oh, I was
time,
I was
please.
almost finishing actually. I was on my last sentence
Oh,
because I think I've
please,
taken about
let's
half an hour already.
let's take this last sentence.
So my
Give us it.
last sentence really was that again we see the same phenomenon of the neo-fascist rise of the neo-fascist forces, of their turning the anger of the people in the wrong direction. In the case of India, the rise of Modi. In fact, I had kind of predicted in an article, not Modi in particular, but had said in an article written in 2013 that the mass income deflating and unemployment raising policies that were being followed in India were dangerous because they were reminiscent of the kind of policies that Japan had followed and that Germany had followed a century earlier, which had led them uh, into fascism. It would have sounded very far fetched to my colleagues at that time, but the very next year, 2014, in fact, the Neo Fascist Party came to power in India, using, in this case, its rhetoric against our minorities. That is, it had started with rhetoric against the Christians, but then it went on to rhetoric against the Muslims, Muslim minority, blaming them for the distress faced by the masses. And we all know the development after that. It has gone from strength to strength. So I will end by saying that the situation today is extremely grave. And I don't know whether you can hear me.
We can hear you
It
very
calls
well.
for a unity and a bringing together of all anti fascist forces, regardless of all differences that we might have. We have to forget those differences and unite to face the enormous dangers that the world uh, finds itself in today. It is not yet too late, but we have to be aware of the immensity of this danger. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
I know it's a bit weird. Thank you very much, Utsa. I'll hand you over to Vijay, who will moderate. I think we will maybe also have a chance, because we're
Yes.
good in time, to take some questions from the audience, technology permitting.
Okay. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting. I want to ask you one question before I open to the audience, which is that let's take the example of India and Mr. Modi's government, which has been now in power for 11 years and has won 3 general elections. Admittedly, the third one with a slightly diminished mandate. But in 11 years, it has also promoted income deflationary policies. So what price do these neo-fascist governments pay for following effectively neoliberal policies just like their predecessors, even if they try their best to displace anger at minorities? At what point do they have to themselves pay a price for this?
Would you like me to take questions together or
Yeah,
one by one?
let's start with this, and I think people are thinking of questions. Yeah?
Okay.
Okay.
Well, neo fascists are very inventive. To begin with, they come to power using the usual methods of turning people's anger against minorities, misleading them into victimizing minorities, and so on, which in the case of India started with uh, under the earlier BJP government with victimizing the Christians around 1998, 2000, around that time. But now with Modi coming in, he shifted from the Christians, which are a very small minority, to the larger minority, that is the Muslims. And this seems to have a lot of traction to begin with, because how and exactly, uh, in what manner, neoliberal policies are actually harming the people is very difficult to explain, even to trained economists, leave alone to the general population, because the entire media is taken over by the neo-fascists and before them by the neoliberals. I was not allowed to speak on Indian television for 10 years before Mr. Modi came to power because I was arguing that poverty was actually rising. Okay? So dissenting voices are barred from the media. Now, of course, it has gone to the point where dissenting voices are actually incarcerated. They are put in prison on trumped up charges and so on. So, the manipulation of news, spreading of fake news, almost control over the media, terrorizing media persons, terrorizing honest people through using the instruments of state power, particularly the Enforcement Directorate in India, as you know, carries out tax raids on political opponents of the government. So all these methods have been used very, very effectively to project a picture of an India which is a false picture, of a prospering India, one in which the masses are being lifted out of poverty and so on. Okay. Now, that is part of the answer. Of course, this cannot go on forever. And under Mr. Modi, we had demonetization, which was a crazy thing to have done, which actually caused a recession within India. And after the demonetization, his popularity had gone down considerably. When just before the election, the Pulwama incident, which I believed actually may well have been engineered, as many people have argued. I don't know enough about it myself, but informed people say that there was no intelligence failure. You remember dozens of, paramilitary forces were actually killed just prior to the election by allegedly terrorist bombs. And that is what turned the tide and which brought Mr. Modi back to power with a huge majority, okay, in his second term. Now, this kind of manipulation we see in the case of Germany, we see the Reichstag fire, for example, we see in the case of Japan, when it wanted to invade China, it invented the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and then the Kwantung Army marched into China in 1937. So, manipulation of the media, manipulation of the repressive organs of the state, ruthless use of these repressive organs, and manipulation even to the point of, you know, uh, undertaking substantial, what today would be called friendly fire, collateral damage. Hitler's getting rid of the brown shirts, for example, massacre of the brown shirts. All these are the unsavory methods by which neo-fascists stay in power. So yes, it's a difficult situation.
Of course, in Germany, there's no suppression of dissent.
No.
And it just doesn't happen in Germany, especially Germans are very politely asked to protest against the genocide against the Palestinians. Even the government must support the protesters in Germany. Anybody want to ask a quick couple of questions?
And if you have questions in English or in German, if you prefer to in German, we can also translate quickly because Utsa will only hear the English.
Hi, thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I wanted to ask, can you hear me well?
Can you hear her? Utsa, can you hear?
I can hear, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to ask, because I'm really interested, in America you can see that tech
But
oligarchs...
Vijay, could you please relay the question because it's not very clear.
Okay.
If you can-
I've not started yet.
Okay, no problem.
Okay. I wanted to ask, because in America you can see how tech oligarchs are kind of moving from platform capitalism to trying to get more government contracts in order to take more direct influence in politics. And I wanted to ask how capitalism is moving in India. Like what strategies are they using there?
So what was the question, Vijay?
Yeah, the question was how in the US the tech oligarchs, the platform capitalists, are looking for more government contracts. And that's the direction in which they are moving in the United States. What are some of the strategies being used by, let's say, the billionaires in India? Right? The Adanis and so on, I suppose.
Oh, I'm sure that I'm not very competent to answer that question because I have not really studied, as it were, uh, our new monopoly groups like the Adanis, Ambanis, and so on, and their shenanigans. There are other people who have done so. But part of this, Indian government completely reversing its foreign policy uh, and going back from its traditional support for Palestine to support for Israel, to the extent that it even abstained from condemning the genocide in Gaza, which even advanced capitalist countries have supported recently in the United Nations. A part of that has to do, of course, with the economic deals that our new monopoly capitalists, who, by the way, are very similar to the Shinko Zaibatsu in Japan, who went into Korea and so on. They were not the old monopoly houses, but they were the new ones, who had mushroomed in the last 2 decades. So that has to do with the fact that they want to buy arms from Israel. They want some kind of technology transfer from Israel. So they're prepared to absolutely overturn our foreign policy and to ignore, as it were, the blatant genocide which is going on in Gaza before our eyes.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the port of Haifa is owned by one of these Indian billionaires, which was hit by an Iranian missile. Yeah, I'm just saying that factually. My smile is parenthetical. It's not an editorial comment. Another quick question. In the back, there's a question.
Hello. Professor, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you,
Okay.
but Vijay, you will again have to relay the question.
Yes,
Yeah.
no problem.
First of all, thanks a lot for your input. It's definitely a privilege for us to have you here. The thesis that you gave, that the neoliberalism is a renewed domination of finance capital, I think that's a very important overall thesis, something that we can overall, during the course of this conference, keep that in mind. However, I have some questions or some unclarities. First, you say that it is the finance capital which is interested in austerity. I would say capital in general is interested in austerity. Why? Because the basic contradiction is between capital and labor. And secondly, the two circuits of capital that you talk about, one MCM prime, which is the industrial capital, which is interested in the production, and then the second circuit, which is M to M prime directly, which is not interested in production. And there you say that the money of the finance capital, of the second circuit, comes from interest and not from profit. And there I'm unsure because I see interest as part of the profit itself. And the two circuits that you talk about, which are different, however, I would say, or as I understand, please correct me there, they are not two binaries. Of course, the finance capital is detached from direct production. However, it is not independent of production. It is still the most reactionary, most centralized sections of capital, which is globalizing production all over the world. So there I have unclarity. And one larger question that I have, why in your analysis, why do you put M to M prime at the center of your analysis, if that's how I sort of understood. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I could follow the question. So, Vijay, you don't have to say anything about it. No, I have not put it at the center of my analysis. I've simply said that if we want to get, because my economist colleagues have often said that there is no doubt that deflationary policies are followed by finance, but why? Or are followed under capitalism today, but why? It is not very clear why. So I was suggesting that, if you go back to Marx, Marx is always a perennial source of new insights or renewal of old insights. I myself find it a tremendously rich source of an insight that finance capital actually delinks itself from production in ways that you cannot even imagine here. One of my colleagues, Dr. Chandrasekhar, was pointing out in a lecture recently that I attended that now finance is going into uh, privatizing and making money out of spectrum. It has been doing so for some time, out of spectrum, out of imaginary currencies, bitcoins and so on. It is privatizing the air. It is privatizing water in many ways. So it is delinking itself from normal production as we know it. And it seems to have a dynamic of its own. It creates bubbles which go on getting bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually they burst. And when you say there's no difference between finance and general capital, I would disagree with that. Because when you think of capital, you probably only think of big capital, of monopoly capital. But in day to day lives, there are millions, particularly in the global south, there are hundreds and thousands of small capitalists who employ, small amounts of working capital, small amounts of fixed capital, employ perhaps 5 workers, 10 workers, up to 20 workers. They would be really considered very small. So they are also capitalists. And this is the kind of capital in production which is getting wiped out and decimated by finance capital. The process of concentration and centralization is going on all the time. So you get what Barrington Moore had rather misleadingly called anti-capitalist terrorism in Japan, for example. The secret societies which were formed started attacking the giant zaibatsu houses. It's not anti-capitalist, it's anti-monopoly. These were the small capitalists who were getting displaced, who were themselves becoming bankrupt. You see the same thing happening in the United States. A large part of Trump's voter base does not necessarily come only from the working class, who have lost jobs because of relocation of industry to the global south. It also comes from the fact that small capitalists, small businesses, family businesses are simply competed out by big capital. So I think the distinction between capital in production and capital purely in finance is very important. And the dominance of finance capital reveals itself in the fact that monopoly capital now is linked and interlinked and united with finance capital. Just as in Germany in the last century, you had the famous, marriage between the fascist party, Hitler's party, and Krupp's, the largest steel producer. Now, Krupp's was a monopoly producer, okay? And in order to achieve this marriage, Hitler had the brown shirts decimated because they were anti big capital. Their movement had started as anti big capital. Okay? So it's a complex situation. Similarly, here we are finding in India that the anti monopoly sentiment is also quite strong among small capitalists, not just amongst the working class. I don't know whether I've answered your question, but we can always resume the thing through email if you want further clarification.
No, that was a superb answer, I think, personally. Capital is at different levels. There's one more hand back there. That'll be the last question. Okay, you've got somebody already? Okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question concerning hyper-financial capitalism. I think we're living at a time where hyper-financial capitalism is, overwhelmingly taking the money. Is there, from an economic point of view, a possibility that this approach crashes due to speculation? I mean, they're making a lot of money through speculation. And I wonder, is there a point when this can come to an end by itself? At the same time, I wanted to ask, we are more and more confronted with more and more dehumanized working conditions. We are asked to work more and more. I still remember in the 80s when we were thinking at some stage we are going to work half day or 3 days a week. This has been completely taken away from us. And I wonder what is our opportunity, apart from getting together and putting the pressure, which is a problem because I see the division between the opposing forces in many countries. So what is the opportunity for us to change that? Thank you.
Well, I can only say, speak from the experience of my own country, which I know better than other countries. European problems I'm really somewhat unfamiliar with. But at the general level, your question about this hyperfinance is very true. But hyperfinance also is a bubble. And the problem with all these bubbles is that they cannot ultimately get rid of the problem of unemployment, the growing problem of unemployment. You see, in the 19th century, technological change in Europe meant enormous displacement of workers from traditional occupations, from artisanal production. But Europeans solved that problem by simply exporting their unemployed to the New World, where, of course, the indigenous populations were partly massacred, partly driven into reservations, and this vast resources of the New World were taken over by European migrants. And if you look at the rate of migration, it is phenomenal from the capitalist countries. If we had the same rate of migration over the last 50 years in India, 400 million Indians should have migrated out of India by now. But they have nowhere to go to. The actual Indian diaspora is less than 20 million. Anyway, coming back to the present, um, the thing is, the problem of unemployment can only be exacerbated by the kind of technological change which is accompanying this hyperfinance. It is also linked to technological change of a different order. Now it is to do with the a development of artificial intelligence, of development of extremely advanced forms of warfare, which require rare earths and so on. So the Japanese went into Korea because they didn't have the aluminium and the molybdenite which they needed for building aircraft. Nowadays, America and Western Europe wants to seize the rare minerals from the Ukraine, from Russia, from Greenland. So it is again the same resource grab, only of new minerals, which are suitable for the new type of technological change taking place. But no amount of this hyperfinance bubbles, technological change can solve the basic problem of unemployment and livelihoods. And ultimately, that is the important thing. And there are no new worlds for even Europeans to migrate to, and leave alone any new world for the population of the global south to migrate to. So that is what is the bedrock on which the progressive movements of the working class and anti-fascist movements have to build on. And the first thing that any nation state has to do is to say that we will not allow global finance capital to dictate our economic policy. We will close our economic space. We will impose capital controls. We will trade with like-minded other countries. Very small beginnings in this direction have already started taking place. But this is something which needs to be generalized, and it needs to be urged that progressive forces everywhere, whether they're in the global north or the south, have to unite in order to meet this very dire challenge of the rise of neo-fascism that we are facing today. What has been very heartening, and I'll end on that, is the joint declaration my husband drew my attention to this morning, made by the Israeli Communist Party and the Iranian Communist Party. I don't know how many supporters the Israeli Communist Party has, but they issued a joint declaration, wonderfully phrased, opposing the genocide in Gaza, opposing the attacks on Iran, and so on. So that is the way forward. Thank you.
After a presentation like this, I can almost imagine a different kind of India where Utsa Patnaik is the finance minister. It's actually
I'll be dead long before that.
oh, please, please. You never know what's going to happen when the people unite. Thanks a lot. That was really tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience in listening. Thank you.